Well, time to wrap up the final video on Griffin's book on human rights, chapter 15B. So we had one before this, 15A, on group rights. So 15B, group rights. Let's wrap this up and move on to other things. So we've seen in the first video on group rights that there were a couple of, there was a bad argument that against group rights, and normally that is sort of an argument that groups don't have agency, et cetera, et cetera. So we looked at Griffin's response. He doesn't think that's a good argument against group rights. And instead he flips the question and says, well, instead of looking at arguments against group rights, what are two good arguments in favor of group rights? The first argument is based on kind of the convention now of extending goods beyond that of normative agency. And so there could be collective goods like conviviality, I gave that example, fraternity, egalite, that kind of stuff. Those could be predicates or properties of the good, and that we'd want to protect that. So, okay, so that good accrues just to the group. You want to protect it. That group has a group right. He doesn't think that works all that well because he thinks in the end those are all reducible. And he thinks, not surprisingly, most of these group rights claims really are moral rights claims, and they're reducible to individuals. So he doesn't think that the group rights claims per se are trivial, unimportant. No. He's just maybe the same thing as he's been arguing consistently. There's been an inflation of rights, an inflation of human rights, and group rights as a movement is largely another example of the inflation of rights. We can do and handle all this morally significant claims here as non-rights claims. So there's no need to go to this human rights stuff. But that's getting a bit ahead of the picture. I'm going to slow down and back up and look at, he thinks there are justice-based arguments for group rights, not just good-based, but justice-based. He thinks it works a little better, but in the end, it's not going to work all that well. But it raises issues of justice, and he thinks a lot of those claims of group rights are really claims of distributive justice. And we've seen that's not the kind of justice like procedural justice, which is part of the human rights discourse. But that, of course, doesn't mean that distributive justice is unimportant, not in the least. Okay, so the justice-based arguments for group rights, GR for group rights, deal with matters of importance. There's no question that culture, for instance, and groups are extremely important to individuals. You know, lots of people, they take their identities from them, all kinds of stuff. So Griffin is not by any means saying that groups are unimportant. So even, right, remember, he doesn't think that people with advanced cases of dementia and infants have human rights, but he's never even come close to saying that they don't have extreme moral significance and dignity and all that stuff. It's just they're not in the domain of rights discourse. So again, keep that in mind, that denying a human rights discourse to a certain group or an entity of some kind is not to say that that group or entity is unimportant. So no question, well, I'll say it again, no question that groups like cultures, etc., are extremely important. They have moral significance, no question there. But this significance does not rise to the level of grounding rights, right? So babies have moral significance and all that, but it's not going to ground a human right the way the normative discussion of Griffin's does. Cultures, on the other hand, but this raises the fascinating and very hotly debated and sensitive question of what exactly are you talking about when you talk about a culture. It's sensitive that, I'm not about to use a particular example. I'm going to talk about culture in the abstract because people will just claim there's bias or whatever. But think about the notion of a culture. Now let's follow what Griffin says about cultures per se. He says, and again, you can attack him at the foundations of what he's saying about a culture, but he thinks that cultures really are more or less large-scale historical structures that we live in, right? And what are they? Well, they're variable. You look at the histories of cultures, they do change a lot. It's very difficult to say, when the changes in a culture are really important or unimportant, or culture deeply changes. We do know that some cultures have disappeared. They don't exist anymore. How did they fade out? Were they destroyed? These are interesting and controversial questions too. But the main thing is that cultures are large-scale structures, variable, open to change. Well, that seems to be kind of shall we say, a descriptive point. Now comes the evaluative point. They're open to criticism. Now that is a particular kind of normative way of thinking about cultures, right? Like you should be able to criticize them. And a lot of people don't like that. But in any case, so this is Griffin's line. He's saying that cultures are open to criticism. And then based on this more or less open to criticism and the descriptive notion of it's hard to pin down exactly, like the necessary and sufficient conditions for a culture, he's going to say that cultures, because of all this, they really don't have a right to freeze and be preserved. Freeze is in, they don't change anymore, and they're just, there's an obligation now to preserve that frozen moment of a culture. Well, not surprisingly, in the old way of studying biology, right, when they studied living creatures, they often embalm them. So you look at, but those are dead creatures, right? So Griffin is picking up on this metaphor. Like, what are you doing when you preserve a culture? Again, very contentious stuff, but let's see what he has to say. Well, he thinks that preserving a culture is going to require decisions about culture X, whatever that is. You make decisions. Like, what's X's essence? Like, what are the conditions of it? What would be the things that are the accidents of the culture, like the things you could change, but the other things that you couldn't. If you change them, that would be that would be destroying the culture. Well, this gets into pretty tricky territory when you start talking about cultures, and they may have some things that maybe are ethically problematic. Maybe they have certain prejudices or biases or whatever. Are those still a part of the culture? And should they be changed or should they not be changed? Anyways, lots of questions to ask when you're talking about, when you're talking about preserving it. What exactly are you preserving, and what are you not preserving? And can one instance? Oh, here's another one. This is sort of the more general question of what is a culture. But think about what like in politics, we really don't have the case. We really want to say that one, like in the British parliamentary system, one parliament doesn't really bind another. Even constitutions can be modified. A constitution doesn't completely bind a government, because a government has ways, if they get enough, like in Canada, there are ways to amend the Constitution. So the Constitution that is, brought into existence by one parliament will not absolutely bind the others for in perpetuity. Why? Because you can change these constitutions. It might be difficult. It's fairly difficult in the Canadian context to do it. It's extraordinarily difficult in the American context to change their constitution, but they have done it. We do have the principle that one group cannot bind all future groups. So if you talk about, so that raises the thing with culture. Like, if you're preserving it, who gets to say what the particular state is? So in addition to the complexities of what that state will look like, who gets to say that's the state we're going to preserve? So this, again, this general reflection on culture, Griffin says, well, look, as I alluded to earlier, preserving is a kind of embalming, and embalming is not really a form of life. An embalmed culture, that's a museum piece. And it's not a form of life anymore, and that's what a culture is. A culture is a form of life. So he thinks that there's a deep problem with, rights to exist and rights of preservation or whatnot. So this raises these kinds of philosophical problems. However, again, though, that doesn't mean that, groups and all that stuff and culture is not important. No, he's not saying that at all. But he's saying that many of the group rights that are asserted on behalf of cultures, of nations, etc., rights of existence and all these things, and rights to fair treatment and all that stuff, those are really claims about justice. And those are morally significant, but they're just not rights claims. So when we consider, rights of minorities and all that stuff, it's not really a group right. It's more of a distributive justice issue. In any case, he goes and addresses a number of some very interesting thinkers who do take this second line of a justice base. So what Griffin's has done is looked at a couple of different thinkers, very interesting, very profound thinkers, who push either one of these lines. And Griffin thinks in the end, these kinds of approaches to group rights don't work. But of course, we're still in the situation that just because you've managed to with respect to the question of establishing group rights, if you've said, well, okay, I've managed to knock off two arguments in favor of group rights, well, there's two. Maybe there's a third one. Griffin doesn't, where's the third one? So Griffin admits that he hasn't knocked them all off by any stretch. There could be other conceptualizations of group rights than the good-based or the justice-based. There could be, 3, 4, 5, many different conceptualizations of what would be the basis for arguing for a group right that he hasn't addressed here. So he's not saying that I've got them all. He's saying I can't address them all up front, but I've addressed a couple of the important ones, and they leave the situation wanting. It doesn't really seem to get what he wants. So he ends his book on with a couple of really tiny little reflections that are interesting. He issues a challenge to those who insist on this third generation of rights, namely group rights, in addition to the classic liberty type rights, first generation and the second generation of welfare rights. If you really want to be a third generation type thinker on this, he thinks that what really there are sort of kind of group rights that escape what he calls this dichotomy of reduction and exclusion. That in the end, what rights really aren't reduced down or are not really rights, you get basically moral claims, and that's in the end what you get, and they're significant, and we should treat them significantly, but we should not be using the discourse of rights about that. What we should be doing is we should abandon really the whole notion of group rights and just go with the first couple of generations of rights. And let it go at that. And on that, he draws the book to a conclusion, thinking that basically he's done his job of giving us a theory of grounding the notion of human rights in normativity, but also by no means equating rights with the much larger field of moral significance. So all these things about of moral significance that lie outside of human rights, they're certainly morally significant. Morality, at the end of it all, is much broader than the discourse of rights.